The scenario seems like pure fantasy. Nazi Germany invading the continental United States. Yet in the early 1940s, this wasn't just a paranoid American fear. German military planners actually studied the possibility. U-boats prowled American coastlines, sinking ships within sight of shore. And Hitler himself occasionally mused about what conquering America would require. The question isn't whether Germany could have successfully invaded the United States. They couldn't have. But rather what such an attempt would have revealed about German capabilities, American vulnerabilities, and the sheer logistical impossibility of projecting military power across the Atlantic Ocean in the 1940s. Let's explore what would have happened if Hitler had actually tried. First, we need to establish the baseline reality. Germany had no capability to launch a conventional, amphibious invasion of the United States mainland. None whatsoever. The Marine, Germany's Navy, was a fraction of the size of the Royal Navy or the U.S. Navy. By 1941, Germany possessed roughly a dozen capital ships compared to America's hundreds. The German surface fleet had been designed for commerce rating and coastal defense, not for projecting power across oceans. Admiral Erich Erder, commander of the CRE Marine, knew this intimately when Hitler occasionally mentioned the possibility of operations against America. Ryder would politely explain the mathematical impossibility of the task. But let's imagine Hitler and a fit of megalomania even more extreme than his historical decision had ordered an invasion of the United States. What would this have required? And at what point would reality have shattered the fantasy? The logistical challenges begin immediately. To invade America, Germany would first need to achieve naval superiority in the Atlantic Ocean. This means destroying or neutralizing both the Royal Navy and the U.S. Navy simultaneously. The Royal Navy alone outnumbered the Kriegsmarine by a ratio of roughly 10-to-1 in capital ships. The U.S. Navy was even larger. Combined, the Allied navies represented a force that Germany had absolutely no prospect of defeating in conventional naval warfare. Germany's surface fleet had scored some impressive victories. The sinking of HMS Hood comes to mind. But these were isolated tactical successes, not strategic game-changers. Germany's only realistic naval asset for Atlantic operations was its U-boat fleet. At their peak, German submarines did inflict terrible losses on Allied shipping, sinking millions often of merchant vessels. Operation Drumbeat in early 1942 saw U-boat operating brazenly off the American East Coast, sinking tankers and freighters within sight of cities like New York and Miami. American beachgoers could watch ships burning on the horizon. This created genuine panic along the Atlantic's aboard. And some historians argue this represented the closest Germany ever came to genuinely threatening American security. But submarine warfare and amphibious invasion are entirely different operations. U-boat could sink undefended merchant ships, but they couldn't protect an invasion fleet, couldn't suppress coastal defenses, couldn't provide their superiority necessary for a landing, and couldn't transport or supply an invasion force. For Germany to invade America, they would need what they utterly lacked. Hundreds of transport ships, dozens of escort vessels, air superiority over the landing zones, and a logistics train capable of supporting an army thousands of miles from home. Let's game out the scenario anyway. Assume Hitler orders the invasion for summer 1942, after America has entered the war, but before U.S. war production has reached full capacity. Where would Germany even land? The German planning staff would face an immediate dilemma. Every potential landing site on the American coast presents insurmountable problems. The East Coast from Maine to Florida offers numerous harbors and beaches, but it's also the most heavily defended region of the United States. By 1942, the U.S. had established coastal artillery, air bases, and naval facilities throughout the eastern seaboard. The U.S. Army, while not yet fully mobilized for overseas deployment, had substantial forces stationed domestically. Any German fleet approaching the East Coast would be detected hundreds of miles out by American air patrols, and would face attacks from both land-based aircraft and naval vessels long before reaching landing range. Some German planners in our alternate scenario might suggest landing in a less defended area, perhaps the Gulf Coast, or even attempting to seize a Caribbean island as a staging point. This makes slightly more sense logistically, as the distance from occupied France to the Caribbean is marginally less suicidal than crossing to New York. But it doesn't solve the fundamental problem, getting an invasion force across the Atlantic undetected or surviving the inevitable American response. Let's say impossibly that Germany manages to assemble an invasion fleet of 200 ships, transports, escorts and supply vessels in occupied French ports. This would represent essentially the entire German surface navy, plus every available transport and merchant vessel stripped from other theaters. Loading this fleet would take weeks, during which American and British intelligence would certainly detect the build-up. The Germans wouldn't achieve surprise, which is the only possible advantage an inferior force can leverage. The fleet departs. Crossing the Atlantic and convoy formation would take approximately 2 weeks, during which the flotilla would be vulnerable to Allied air attack and submarine interdiction for the entire journey. The Royal Navy would sortie everything available to intercept. American submarines would take up positions along the route. Land-based bombers from Britain, Iceland, Greenland, and eventually New Finland would hammer the convoy continuously. The Luftwaffe couldn't provide air cover more than a few hundred miles from European shores, leaving the invasion fleet defenseless for 90% of the crossing. Realistically, such a fleet would be decimated before getting halfway across the Atlantic. But let's assume Hitler has made a pact with the devil and the fleet somehow reaches American waters intact. Now comes the actual invasion where fantasy truly collides with reality. The German army would need to land at least 10 divisions, roughly 150,000 men, to have any hope of establishing a beachhead. This would require a landing operation vastly larger than the historical Normandy invasion, which took the Allies years to prepare and involved the largest amphibious force ever assembled. Germany in 1942 possessed neither the specialized landing craft, the amphibious expertise, nor the doctrine to conduct such an operation. The Wehrmacht had virtually no experience with amphibious assaults. Their only comparable operation, the invasion of Cree in 1941, was an airborne assault that suffered catastrophic casualties despite facing relatively light opposition. Assuming the German fleet somehow reaches the American coast, let's say they target North Carolina's Outer Banks, thinking it might be less defended than major cities, the landing itself would be a slaughter. American coastal artillery would begin firing at 15 to 20 miss range. U.S. Army, Air Force's fighters and bombers would attack continuously. The U.S. Navy would engage from the sea. And even if German soldiers managed to reach the beaches, they would face entrenched defenders with no possibility of reinforcement or supply. The Americans would have an overwhelming advantage in every category: numbers, firepower, logistics, intelligence, air superiority, and most critically, interior lines of communication. The United States could rush reinforcements to any landing site via rail and road networks far faster than Germany could deliver additional forces across the Atlantic. Within days, the Germans would face tens of thousands of American troops. Within a week, hundreds of thousands. The U.S. Army in 1942 had over 3 million men under arms, with millions more in training. But let's push the scenario to its absolute breaking point. Assume the Germans somehow establish a beachhead. They've landed 150,000 men and managed to secure a perimeter maybe 20 meters deep. What happens next? This is where the invasion is conclusively, not from military action, but from logistical mathematics. An army of 150,000 men in active combat requires approximately 10,000 tons of supplies daily. Ammunition, food, fuel, medical supplies, spare parts, and everything else modern warfare demands. This means Germany would need to deliver roughly 70 large transport ships worth of supplies every single day continuously across an Atlantic Ocean controlled by hostile naval and air forces. It's impossible. Even if the Germans had the ships, which they didn't, the Allies would sink them faster than they could deliver. Within a week, the German invasion force would be out of ammunition. Within 2 weeks, they'd be starving. Without fuel for vehicles and aircraft, they'd be immobile, surrounded, outnumbered, cut off from resupply, and facing an increasingly angry American military that was in the process of mobilizing millions more troops. The German beachhead would last perhaps a month before surrendering. The casualties would be staggering. Conservative estimates suggest the Germans would lose their entire invasion force, 150,000 men captured or killed, plus the majority of their invasion fleet. The Kriegsmarine would effectively cease to exist as a fighting force. Germany would have sacrificed irreplaceable resources for no strategic gain whatsoever. Hitler would have handed the Allies a propaganda victory of incalculable value and demonstrated German military incompetence on a spectacular scale. Now, let's consider a slightly different scenario that some historians argue was more plausible. Germany attempting to seize territories in the Western Hemisphere rather than invading the continental United States directly. This was actually part of German strategic thinking in the early war years. Before America entered the war, German planners studied the possibility of seizing footholds in South America, particularly in countries with significant German immigrant populations like Brazil, Argentina, and Chile. The idea was to establish bases that could threaten American shipping, serve as U-boat supply points, and potentially provide launching points for future operations. Some Latin American countries had pro-German factions, and there were concerns in Washington that Nazi ideology might spread in the region. This scenario is more plausible than a direct invasion of the United States, but still ultimately doomed. To seize and hold territory in South America, Germany would need to project military power across an even greater distance than an invasion of North America would require. They'd face opposition not just from local forces, but inevitably from American intervention under the Monroe Doctrine. President Roosevelt had made clear that any European military presence in the Western Hemisphere would be considered an act of war. The United States would respond with overwhelming force, and Germany would face the same logistical nightmares, now compounded by operating even further from European bases. There's also the question of what strategic purpose such bases would serve. Germany's war aims were European domination, and leans in the East operations in the Americas would divert resources from these core objectives without providing commensurate benefits. Even if Germany somehow established bases in South America, they couldn't use them to significantly impact the war's outcome. At best, they might marginally increase pressure on Allied shipping, but nothing that would outweigh the costs. Some alternate history scenarios posit Germany first defeating Britain and the Soviet Union, then turning attention to the Americas from a position of total European dominance. This was Hitler's long-term fantasy, a German superpower controlling Europe and Africa, eventually confronting the United States for global supremacy. But this scenario requires Germany winning a war they historically lost, which is its own separate implausibility. And even if Germany had conquered all of Europe and Russia, the resources required to hold this empire would preclude major operations across the Atlantic. Hitler would be tied down in endless occupation duties, partisan warfare, and resource extraction from conquered territories. Let's also address the only German operation that actually did reach American soil, Operation Taurus, in June 1942. This was Germany's actual attempt at striking the American homeland, and its failure illustrates why larger operations were never attempted. 8 German saboteurs were landed by U-boat on beaches in New York and Florida, with orders to sabotage American war production facilities, factories, railroads, bridges, and power plants. The operation was a complete disaster. Within 2 weeks, all 8 men were captured, largely because 2 of them immediately turned themselves in to the FBI. 6 were executed, and the operation accomplished nothing except demonstrating how thoroughly American security services dominated the domestic theater. If Germany couldn't successfully land 8 spies without immediate detection and capture, how could they possibly land 150,000 soldiers? The only remotely plausible way Germany could have threatened the American mainland would have been through strategic bombing or missile attacks, not ground invasion. German development of long-range bombers or intercontinental ballistic missiles might have allowed them to strike American cities, creating terror and disruption without requiring the impossible logistics of an invasion. Germany did develop the V-2 rocket, the world's first ballistic missile, but its range was only about 200 missimeters, sufficient to hit London from occupied France, but nowhere near capable of crossing the Atlantic. Some German engineers proposed developing the America Bomber, a long-range aircraft capable of striking New York from European bases. Various designs were studied, including some truly exotic concepts like multi-stage bombers or aircraft launched from submarines. None progressed beyond the prototype stage, and for good reason. The technical challenges were immense, the resource requirements were prohibitive, and the strategic payoff was questionable. Even if Germany had developed such aircraft, they could only deliver bombs, not occupy territory or achieve decisive military results. There's also the nuclear dimension to consider. If Germany had developed atomic weapons before the United States, which they were nowhere close to doing historically, they theoretically could have delivered them via long-range aircraft or missiles. This would have changed the calculus entirely, making physical invasion unnecessary. But Germany's atomic program was badly mismanaged, underfunded, and based on flawed theoretical understanding. Most German scientists didn't believe atomic weapons were feasible during the war's time frame. Meanwhile, the Manhattan Project employed 130,000 people and cost $2 billion. Germany never made a comparable commitment, and Hitler personally dismissed atomic physics as Jewish science. So we return to the fundamental reality. Germany invading America was never a realistic possibility. The logistical, naval, and military requirements were so far beyond German capabilities that serious planning never occurred. When Admiral Ader briefed Hitler on naval capabilities, the Führer occasionally asked about operations against America, and Raeder would explain with barely concealed exasperation that Germany couldn't even successfully invade Britain across 21 mi of English Channel, let alone America, across 3,000 mi of Atlantic Ocean. The Battle of Britain in 1940 demonstrated Germany's inability to achieve even the preconditions for invading a nearby island nation. The Luftwaffe failed to gain air superiority over Britain despite numerical advantages and fighting over friendly territory with short supply lines. The Kriegsmarine couldn't protect an invasion fleet in the Channel. Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, was postponed indefinitely and eventually cancelled because it was recognized as suicidal. If Germany couldn't invade Britain, they certainly couldn't invade America. The distances were longer, the American military was larger, American industrial capacity dwarfed Britain's, and the United States had strategic depth that made conquest effectively impossible. Even if German forces had somehow landed and seized New York City, the most fantastical scenario imaginable, America would simply continue fighting from Chicago or Los Angeles or any of dozens of other major cities. The United States, in the 1940s, possessed industrial capacity exceeding the rest of the world combined. By 1943, American factories were producing more aircraft than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. American shipyards were launching a Liberty ship every day and aircraft carriers every few months. The only way Germany could have truly threatened America would have been through destroying American will to fight, not through military conquest. This is why Operation Pastorius targeted civilian morale through sabotage. The goal was to create fear and panic, not to achieve military objectives. But Americans in the 1940s were not a people easily terrorized. Pearl Harbor had united the nation in fury, not fear. German sabotage or even theoretical bombing raids would have strengthened American resolve, not weakened it. Ultimately, the question of what would have happened if Germany invaded America is best answered by understanding what actually happened when Germany made similar miscalculations. Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union in June 1941 was based on similarly delusional assumptions. About enemy weakness and German superiority, Hitler believed the Red Army would collapse within weeks, that Soviet society would fracture under pressure, and that Germany's ideological and racial superiority would carry the day. Instead, the invasion became a quagmire that destroyed the Wehrmacht and led directly to Germany's defeat. An invasion of America would have been Operation Barbarossa multiplied by infinity. All the same delusions, all the same logistical impossibilities, but now conducted across an ocean against an even more powerful enemy with even longer supply lines. The result would have been not just German defeat, but potentially the complete destruction of the Nazi regime years earlier than occurred historically. Roosevelt would have had the propaganda coup of the century. German soldiers dying on American beaches would have united every faction in American society behind total war. The invasion would have failed within days, and the psychological impact on both German and Allied morale would have been incalculable. So what would have happened if Hitler had invaded America? The Nazi regime would have committed suicide in the most spectacular military disaster in history. American forces would have captured or killed the entire invasion force, and World War II would have ended sooner with even more complete Allied victory. The battle Hitler never fought was one he could never have won. And the fact that even Hitler recognized this impossibility speaks to just how fantastical their scenario truly